The pristine corridors of Pinecrest Memorial Hospital had always been considered a sanctuary of healing in the quiet town of Westlake, Ohio. But on a cold December morning, those same hallways became the backdrop for what would later be described as one of the most chilling medical crimes in recent history. Alex Rivera, a 42-year-old construction worker, arrived at his routine follow-up appointment complaining of persistent fatigue, unexplained weight loss, and night sweats. What his blood work revealed would set in motion an investigation that would uncover a web of deceit, betrayal of trust, and calculated malice that no one in the medical community could have anticipated. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The test results don't make any sense, Dr. Emily Chen, the hospital's chief of staff, whispered as she stared at the computer screen, her hand trembling slightly. This patient tested negative for HIV 3 months ago during his pre-surgical screening. Now he's positive with an unusually high viral load. The first red flag appeared when 3 more patients from the orthopedic ward reported similar symptoms. Within the same week, all had one thing in common. They had been treated by Dr. Caldwell, a highly regarded orthopedic surgeon who had joined the hospital staff 18 months earlier with glowing recommendations and an impeccable resume, listing degrees from prestigious institutions, including the University of Michigan Medical School. Detective Samantha Moore arrived at Pinecrest Memorial at 9:30 a.m., her leather notebook already in hand as she passed through the sliding glass doors of the main entrance. Tall, with observant hazel eyes and a calm demeanor that put witnesses at ease, Detective Moore had built her reputation on methodical investigation and an almost uncanny ability to sense when someone wasn't telling the truth. The hospital administration had contacted the Westlake Police Department after their internal review suggested something far more sinister than a medical anomaly. "Detective, thank you for coming so quickly," Michael Harrison, the hospital administrator, greeted her, his voice hushed as though the walls themselves might be listening. The administrator's usual confident posture was absent, replaced by stooped shoulders and constantly darting eyes. "We've moved this meeting to the conference room on the 5th floor, away from the main hospital traffic." The small group gathered in the sterile conference room consisted of Dr. Emily Chen, Michael Harrison, and Diane Foster from the hospital's legal counsel. The tension in the room was palpable as Detective Moore took her seat, placing her recorder on the table. "So far, we have 4 patients who have inexplicably tested positive for HIV," Dr. Chen began, sliding a folder across the table. "All were in excellent health prior to their orthopedic procedures, all tested negative during pre-surgical screening, and all were personally treated by Dr. Caldwell." Moore flipped through the medical files, her trained eye noting the similarities. Could this be contaminated equipment, a processing error in the lab? Dr. Chen shook her head firmly. "We've ruled those out. The infections appear to have been introduced during post-operative care. What's more concerning is that the viral strains in all 4 patients appear identical according to preliminary genetic sequencing." "Where is Dr. Caldwell now?" Moore asked, jotting notes in her precise handwriting. "He called in sick yesterday after we announced an emergency staff meeting to discuss irregularities in patient care," Harrison replied. His timing seemed convenient. Before the detective could respond, the door opened and Amanda Garcia, a laboratory technician, entered the room with a flash drive in her gloved hand. Her face was ashen. "You need to see this," she said, connecting the drive to the conference room computer. "I was reviewing the medication disbursement records for the orthopedic department, and I found discrepancies in the inventory logs. Vials, of post-operative analgesics were signed out by Dr. Caldwell at unusual times, often when his patients weren't scheduled for pain management. The screen displayed a series of log entries highlighting the pattern. Moore immediately recognized the significance. He could have been using these opportunities to access the patients without raising suspicion. The detective's next stop was the hospital's Human Resources Department, where she requested Dr. Caldwell's personnel file. What she found raised her suspicions further. His credentials appeared immaculate, almost too perfect. Letters of recommendation glowed with praise, yet lacked the personal anecdotes that typically characterized genuine references. His employment history showed no gaps, no blemishes. An unusual feat in the demanding medical profession where burnout and career changes were common. Has anyone ever verified his medical degree directly with the University of Michigan? Moore asked the HR director, who shifted uncomfortably in her chair. We follow standard procedure. We saw his diploma, checked his medical license with the state board. Everything was in order. Moore made a note to have her department contact the university directly. Something didn't add up. By mid-afternoon, the case took another disturbing turn when Dr. Thomas Weber, the medical examiner, called with urgent news. Detective, I've been reviewing recent deaths at Pinecrest, looking for any patterns connected to your investigation. Weber's voice crackled over the phone. There's something you should know. 2 of Dr. Caldwell's patients died in the past month from what appeared to be complications following routine procedures. Nothing that would raise eyebrows individually, but in light of these new developments. I need those files, doctor, and I need any preserved blood samples you might have, Moore responded, feeling the weight of the case growing by the hour. As Detective Moore left the hospital, she noticed a young nurse sitting alone in the cafeteria, repeatedly checking her phone with visible anxiety. The detective had learned to trust her instincts, and something about the woman's demeanor suggested she knew something. Moore approached casually, showing her badge. I'm Detective Moore, and you are? Lisa Dawson, the nurse replied, her voice barely above a whisper. I've been trying to work up the courage to talk to someone. Over the next 30 minutes, Nurse Dawson revealed information that changed the entire complexion of the investigation. She had been working closely with Dr. Caldwell for the past year and had noticed small peculiarities in his behavior. His reluctance to discuss his medical school days, his avoidance of certain complex procedures despite his claimed expertise, and most disturbingly, his reaction when the hospital announced a routine credential verification for all staff 3 weeks earlier. He completely panicked, Lisa explained. I found him in his office shredding papers. When I asked if everything was okay, he said something about bureaucrats who can't leave well enough alone. Then the next day, he was perfectly calm again, like nothing had happened. Moore leaned forward. Did you ever see him do anything unusual with patients' IV lines or medication? Lisa hesitated, then nodded slowly. Twice. He said he was topping off their pain medication, but it wasn't logged in their charts. I meant to report it, but he's so respected, and I thought maybe I was overthinking things. By evening, Detective Moore had obtained a search warrant for Dr. Caldwell's apartment in Lakeside Heights, an upscale community overlooking Lake Erie. The apartment was meticulously organized, almost sterile in its precision. Moore and her team worked methodically through the space, photographing and cataloging potential evidence. In the home office, Officer Paul Jenkins discovered a false bottom in the desk drawer. Beneath it lay a collection of identification cards. With Caldwell's photo but different names, blank prescription pads from various hospitals across 3 states, and a sealed medical transport container. Detective, you're going to want to see this, Jenkins called out, pointing to the container. Moore approached cautiously, instructing the evidence technician to document everything before opening the container. Inside were several labeled vials. In protective packaging, The labels read HIV plus plasma sample, research only. Call Dr. Chen. Moore instructed immediately. We need to know if anything like this is missing from the hospital lab. The investigation accelerated rapidly after this discovery. Dr. Emily Chen confirmed that no such samples were authorized to leave the hospital's research facilities, and certainly not to be stored in a private residence. Meanwhile, the University of Michigan Medical School had no record of a Nathan Caldwell graduating in the year indicated on his resume, or any year within the past decade. The most chilling discovery came from Amanda Garcia in the laboratory. After testing the vials found in Caldwell's apartment, she confirmed that the HIV strain they contained was genetically identical to the one found in the infected patients. This isn't a coincidence, Garcia explained to Moore. This is the source. Detective Moore organized a briefing with the Westlake Police Department, the hospital administration, and representatives from the Ohio Medical Board. The evidence was mounting toward an inescapable conclusion. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dr. Nathan Caldwell had deliberately infected patients with HIV. We need to locate Caldwell immediately, Moore stated firmly to the assembled group, and we need to identify every patient he's treated since arriving at Pinecrest. Kelly Thompson, a hospital board member who had been silent throughout most of the meeting, finally spoke up. There's something else you should know, Detective. 3 weeks ago, the board received an anonymous email questioning Caldwell's credentials. That's what prompted the verification process. Caldwell was informed of the review the day before the first patient showed symptoms. The timing couldn't be coincidental. It appeared that Caldwell, facing exposure of his fraudulent credentials, had decided to exact revenge on the institution and its patients. The search for Nathan Caldwell intensified over the next 48 hours. His credit card showed no activity since his last day at the hospital, and his cell phone had been turned off. It was as if he had vanished. Detective Moore organized a task force, coordinating with law enforcement agencies across state lines and placing alerts at airports, train stations, and bus terminals. Meanwhile, the hospital faced the daunting task of contacting all of Caldwell's patients, over 200 individuals who had been under his care during his 18 months at Pinecrest. Testing centers were established, counselors were brought in, and a hotline was set up to field the flood of panicked calls. On the third day of the search, Nurse Rebecca Johnson, who had worked closely with Caldwell, approached Detective Moore with information she had been hesitant to share. Dr. Caldwell mentioned a cabin once, she said, fidgeting with her ID badge. He said it was his thinking place, where he went to escape the pressures of medicine. Somewhere near Lake Chatham, I think. Moore's team quickly identified a property near Lake Chatham registered to a James Mercer, one of the aliases found in Caldwell's apartment. By nightfall, local authorities had the remote cabin under surveillance, confirming a man matching Caldwell's description was inside. As the tactical team prepared to move in at dawn, Detective Moore reviewed what they knew about the suspect. Nathan Caldwell, or whatever his real name might be, had constructed an elaborate false identity complete with forged credentials that had fooled multiple institutions. He had practiced medicine without proper training for years, moving from hospital to hospital before settling at Pinecrest. And when faced with the collapse of his carefully constructed facade, he had chosen to weaponize his medical knowledge in the most horrific way. The morning raid on the cabin went smoothly, with Caldwell surrendering without resistance. He appeared almost relieved when the officers burst through his door, as though he had been waiting for the inevitable. Detective Moore arrived as he was being placed in a police cruiser. "Why?" she asked simply, standing by the car door. "Why harm patients who had nothing to do with the investigation?" Caldwell looked at her with unsettling calmness. "They trusted the system that gave me a white coat and called me doctor. You're sure? They're as complicit as the board members who never bothered to check my credentials until someone forced their hand." The full extent of Caldwell's crimes came into focus over the following days. 15 patients had been deliberately infected with HIV, not just the 4 initially identified. Each infection had been carefully administered through contaminated injections during post-operative care, when patients were at their most vulnerable. The method was calculated to ensure the infections wouldn't be detected until long after the procedures, masking the connection to Caldwell's care. Further investigation revealed that Nathan Caldwell was actually Timothy Reeves, a former medical school student who had been expelled in his second year for ethical violations. Over the past decade, he had created multiple identities, each time gathering enough medical knowledge through orderly and assistant positions to convincingly play the role of physician. Pinecrest Memorial had been his longest and most successful deception. As the case moved toward prosecution, the broader implications sent shockwaves through the medical community. How had someone without proper qualifications managed to practice for so long without detection? The answer lay in a combination of institutional complacency, overworked verification systems, and Reeves's meticulous attention to creating believable documentation. The preliminary hearing was scheduled, with Timothy Reeves facing multiple charges, including assault with a deadly weapon, practicing medicine without a license, identity fraud, and attempted murder. The prosecution was building a case that would likely keep him incarcerated for the remainder of his life. Meanwhile, Detective Moore found herself increasingly drawn to the victims' stories. Alex Rivera, the first patient identified, had established a support group for those affected. Moore attended one of their meetings, listening as these individuals grappled with the lifelong consequences of having trusted someone who had betrayed the most fundamental principle of medicine. First, do no harm. The hardest part isn't the diagnosis, Rivera shared with the group. It's knowing that someone deliberately did this to us, that he looked us in the eye, called himself our doctor, and then used that trust as a weapon. The investigation had uncovered the what, the how, and even the why of the case. But as Detective Moore drove home that evening, she couldn't shake the feeling that they had only scratched the surface of understanding the mind of a man who could so thoroughly corrupt the healing profession for his own ego, and then weaponize it when threatened with exposure. The case of the fake doctor who injected patients with HIV would continue to unfold, revealing deeper layers of deception and institutional failure. But one thing was already clear. The scars left on Westlake and Pinecrest Memorial Hospital would take far longer to heal than the physical wounds Dr. Nathan Caldwell had inflicted during his surgeries. The morning after the arrest, Detective Moore sat in her office, reviewing the evidence collected from Caldwell's cabin. Beyond the medical supplies and falsified documents, they had discovered detailed journals dating back nearly a decade. The notebooks chronicled his journey from failed medical student to impersonating a surgeon, written with disturbing pride and meticulous attention to detail. He kept records of every procedure, Moore explained to her captain, notes on techniques. He learned by watching videos, attending conferences under false credentials, even practicing on medical cadavers he somehow accessed. What the journals revealed most clearly was the psychology of a man consumed by entitlement. Timothy Reeves had convinced himself that he deserved the title of doctor despite being expelled from medical school. Each successful deception reinforced his belief that the institutions gatekeeping the medical profession were themselves fraudulent, merely bureaucratic hurdles rather than necessary safeguards. The investigation expanded as Moore traced Reeves' path backward through 3 other hospitals in neighboring states. At each facility, he had worked under different names, always as a specialist who could avoid the closest scrutiny from colleagues. More disturbing was the discovery that patients had experienced unusual complications under his care at each hospital, though none had previously connected these incidents to deliberate harm. He's been practicing his particular form of revenge for years, Dr. Weber observed as he reviewed cases from Reeves's previous positions. The HIV infections at Pinecrest weren't his first acts of violence against patients, just his most extreme. Madame, the scale of institutional failure became increasingly apparent. Hospital after hospital had accepted credentials at face value, relying on the verification processes of previous employers rather than conducting thorough independent checks. Medical boards had issued licenses based on paperwork rather than substantive evaluation. The system had been designed for honest participants, with few safeguards against someone dedicated to exploiting its weaknesses. As Detective Moore prepared for a press conference addressing the growing scandal, Amanda Garcia from the laboratory requested an urgent meeting. "I've been analyzing blood samples from all of Caldwell's, Reeves, patients," Garcia explained, spreading charts across Moore's desk. "We've identified 15 with confirmed HIV infections, but there's something else. 6 other patients show unusual antibody profiles that don't match typical HIV patterns." Moore leaned forward. "What does that mean?" "It means he might have been experimenting with modified strains," Garcia said quietly. "The research lab at Pinecrest has a program studying HIV variants. The samples we found in his apartment could have been altered. This revelation transformed an already horrific case into something potentially more dangerous. If Reeves had been modifying viral strains, the public health implications could extend far beyond the currently identified victims." Detective Moore immediately contacted the CDC, bringing in specialized investigators to assess the potential threat. Dr. Sarah Williams, an infectious disease specialist, arrived the following day to coordinate with the hospital team. "Based on the genetic sequencing, we believe the variant is still responsive to standard antiretroviral treatments," Dr. Williams explained during an emergency meeting with hospital staff. "But we need to identify every possible exposure and monitor these patients for any unusual disease progression." Meanwhile, Moore's investigation uncovered another layer to the case when financial records revealed substantial payments from an offshore account to Reeves over the past 2 years. The payments coincided with his employment at Pinecrest and suggested a complexity beyond personal revenge. Someone was funding him, Moore hypothesized to her investigative team. "These amounts aren't just for living expenses, they're investments." The breakthrough came when Edward Collins, an FBI agent specializing in medical fraud cases, joined the investigation. Collins had been tracking a pharmaceutical executive named Howard Sinclair, whose company, Axiom Pharmaceuticals, had been developing a new HIV treatment. Sinclair's previous drug trials failed spectacularly, Collins explained to Moore. But if he could demonstrate exceptional efficacy against unusual HIV strains, his company would secure millions in research grants and potential patents. The connection was tenuous until they found emails on Reeves's encrypted laptop between him and Sinclair discussing field testing and diverse strain responses in carefully coded language. The pharmaceutical executive had found in Reeves the perfect combination of medical knowledge and moral bankruptcy, someone willing to create test subjects through deliberate infection. As the case expanded to include federal charges of conspiracy and bioterrorism, the human toll continued to mount. Victor Martinez, a patient advocate working with the infected victims, approached Detective Moore with concerning news. "Some of Reeves' patients are being approached by representatives from a company offering experimental treatments free of charge," Martinez reported. They're preying on desperate people who've just received a life-altering diagnosis. Moore's team traced these representatives back to a subsidiary of Axiom Pharmaceuticals, confirming the connection to Howard Sinclair. The pharmaceutical executive was attempting to complete his plan, using Reeves' victims as unwitting test subjects for his company's treatments. The investigation now moved at breakneck speed. Federal agents raided Axiom's headquarters and Sinclair's home simultaneously, securing computers and documents that proved the conspiracy. Howard Sinclair was arrested while attempting to board a private jet to a non-extradition country. For the victims, learning of the broader conspiracy brought a complex mix of emotions. Their infections hadn't been merely the vindictive act of a single disturbed individual, but part of a calculated corporate experiment. They saw us as lab rats, Alex Rivera said during a group therapy session that Moore attended as part of her ongoing case documentation. Not as humans with families, dreams, futures, just data points for their stock prices. The prosecution's case strengthened daily as more evidence emerged. Timothy Reeves eventually agreed to testify against Howard Sinclair in exchange for consideration during sentencing. His testimony revealed the full extent of the conspiracy, how Sinclair had first approached him after discovering his fraudulent credentials, offering protection and payment in exchange for his participation in what was euphemistically called field research. Sinclair told me that pharmaceutical progress had always required sacrifices, Reeves testified. He said history would eventually see us as pioneers who accelerated medical advancement. This rationalization had allowed Reeves to transform his fear of exposure into a grandiose sense of scientific purpose, feeding his narcissistic belief that ordinary ethical constraints didn't apply to his unique talents. The partnership between a fake doctor and a corrupt pharmaceutical executive had created the perfect storm of exploitation and harm. As the trial date approached, Moore returned to Pinecrest Memorial Hospital to meet with Dr. Emily Chen and the hospital board. The institution was implementing comprehensive reforms to its verification processes and establishing new protocols for monitoring unusual patterns in patient outcomes. "We failed these people," Dr. Chen acknowledged, the weight of institutional responsibility evident in her voice. "Every layer of our system that should have protected them instead allowed this to happen." Kelly Thompson, who had first raised concerns about Caldwell's credentials to the board, had been appointed to lead a new patient safety oversight committee. "We're working with other hospitals to create a centralized verification database," Thompson explained. "No more taking credentials at face value, no more assuming previous employers did their due diligence." The most profound conversations Moore had during the investigation were with nurse Lisa Dawson, whose initial suspicions had helped break the case. Despite her critical role in stopping further harm, Dawson struggled with guilt over not speaking up sooner. "I saw things that didn't make sense," she confessed to Moore during a follow-up interview. "But I kept telling myself that someone with his reputation must know what he's doing. That's the power of that white coat and title. It silences your doubts." As the case progressed toward its conclusion, Detective Moore found herself reflecting on the systems of trust that underpin modern medicine, the implicit faith patients place in healthcare providers and institutions. The Caldwell case had exposed dangerous vulnerabilities in those systems, vulnerabilities that existed not just in medical credentials, but in the hierarchical structures that discouraged questioning and reporting of suspicious behavior. 8 months after the first HIV diagnosis that triggered the investigation, Timothy Reeves and Howard Sinclair stood trial. The courtroom was filled with victims and their families, hospital staff, and media representatives from across the country. The case had captured national attention, raising uncomfortable questions about oversight in healthcare and the potential for corporate interests to corrupt medical ethics. Reeves was sentenced to 175 years in prison for 15 counts of assault with a deadly weapon, practicing medicine without a license, identity fraud, and conspiracy. Sinclair received a sentence of 120 years for his role in the conspiracy, bioterrorism charges, and violations of numerous FDA regulations. The judge made it clear that neither would ever walk free again. For the 15 victims who had been deliberately infected with HIV, the verdicts brought a measure of justice but could not reverse their diagnoses. Through the Victim Compensation Fund established after Axiom Pharmaceuticals' assets were seized, they received financial settlements that covered their lifetime medical care. The final breakthrough in the case came unexpectedly, 6 weeks after the sentencing. Amanda Garcia, still analyzing samples from the investigation, discovered that the modified HIV strain injected into the 6 patients identified earlier had been deliberately engineered with a genetic signature, a calling card from its creator. "It's like he wanted credit for his work," Garcia explained to Moore as they examined the genetic sequence. These base pairs here form a pattern that, when translated through certain algorithms, spell out Reeves MD, the degree he never earned. This discovery provided the final piece of the psychological puzzle. Reeves had not just been seeking revenge or money, but recognition for what he considered his scientific achievements. Even in his crimes, he had sought the validation that legitimate medical research had denied him. The Caldwell case transformed protocols at hospitals nationwide. New federal regulations required multi-source verification of medical credentials, regular audits of hospital records, and enhanced protection for whistleblowers who reported concerns about colleagues' behavior or credentials. On the anniversary of Alex Rivera's diagnosis, the case that had launched the investigation, Detective Samantha Moore visited the support group that had formed among Reeves's victims. What she found was no longer just a gathering of victims, but a powerful advocacy organization working to prevent similar crimes in the future. "We're turning what happened to us into protection for others," Rivera told her. His health stabilized with treatment, but his life forever altered. "Every hospital board that hears our story implements better checks. Every medical school that invites us to speak graduates more vigilant doctors." Moore realized that while Reeves and Sinclair would spend their lives behind bars, the true resolution of the case wasn't found in their punishment, but in the systemic changes their crimes had catalyzed. The healthcare system would never be perfect, but it had become more vigilant against those who would exploit it. As Detective Moore filed her final report on the case, she documented not just the crimes and their resolution, but the resilience she had witnessed among those affected. The victims had refused to be defined solely by what had been done to them, transforming their collective trauma into advocacy for a safer medical system. The case of Dr. Nathan Caldwell, or rather Timothy Reeves, would be studied in medical, ethics classes, law enforcement training, and hospital administration programs for generations to come. But for Detective Moore, its most important legacy was the reminder that systems built on trust must earn that trust through constant vigilance and the courage to question when something doesn't seem right. 2 years after the case closed, Pinecrest Memorial Hospital dedicated a new patient safety center named after Alex Rivera, the first patient whose diagnosis had exposed the conspiracy. The center housed training facilities for credential verification, specialists, a whistleblower support program, and research into institutional safeguards against fraud. At the dedication ceremony, Moore watched as Rivera cut the ribbon, his hands steady despite the health challenges he continued to face. Behind him stood Nurse Lisa Dawson, Dr. Emily Chen, and the other healthcare professionals whose collective actions had eventually brought truth to light. The most dangerous predators are those who wear the symbols of protection, Rivera said in his dedication speech. But their power only lasts as long as our silence. Today, we commit to a healthcare system where questions are welcomed, doubts are investigated, and patient safety always comes before institutional reputation. As she listened to his words, Detective Moore understood that the final realization of the case wasn't just about one criminal doctor or corrupt executive, but about the courage required to maintain the integrity of institutions we must trust with our lives. In the face of deliberate harm disguised as healing, that courage had ultimately prevailed. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.